When I first moved into Willow Creek Estates, I believed the neighborhood's glossy brochure. It spoke of calm streets, well-kept yards, and a harmonious community atmosphere. What it didn't mention, what none of the real estate agents dared to reveal, was that the HOA ruled over this so-called harmony with the same subtlety as a wrecking ball. Still, in those early months, I tried to fit in. I trimmed my hedges exactly to regulation height, parked my car well within the approved zone, and kept my trash cans hidden. It wasn't that I feared the HOA. I simply didn't want trouble. Trouble, however, found me. It began with a porch swing. Not the oversized, noise-making variety. Not the kind that hung dangerously or required major installation. Just a simple wooden swing suspended by 2 sturdy ropes from the beam of my front porch. It was the sort of feature any normal neighborhood would see as charming. Something that added life to a space that often felt too quiet. I imagined sitting there after work, sipping cold lemonade, watching the late afternoon sun fall behind the sycamore trees. For a few days, that's exactly what I did. Then came the first letter. The HOA envelope was thin, official-looking, and stamped with the kind of urgency that suggested a matter of national security rather than suburban decor. Inside was a formal notice claiming my porch swing violated aesthetic guidelines. According to them, it disrupted front-facing architectural uniformity. I had read the handbook cover to cover when I moved in. Never once had I seen anything about porch swings. But the letter insisted I remove it within 7 days or face escalating fines. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe someone checked the wrong box. Maybe the HOA president, whom the neighbors referred to with thinly veiled dread, was having a bad day. I decided to give them the benefit of the doubt. I sent a polite email asking for clarification. They replied with a copy-and-paste paragraph referencing vague rules about unaligned structures and non-permanent attachments. No explanation. No reasoning. Just a warning that costs would accumulate if I failed to comply. It bothered me more than I expected. The swing was hardly visible from the street. It wasn't hurting anyone, and it certainly wasn't damaging property values. Yet the HOA treated it as if I had built an illegal shed right on the front lawn. I considered taking it down to avoid conflict, but something in me resisted. It wasn't just about the swing anymore. It was about the principle. If they could target something so harmless, what would be next? Garden decor? Holiday lights? The color of my welcome mat? Still, with their deadline approaching, I had a decision to make. I walked out to the porch one evening, sat on the swing, and let it sway gently as I looked around the neighborhood. Every house seemed quiet, closed off, and overly curated. Nothing about this place felt lived in. Everything was staged, artificial, like a permanent open house. I wondered how many of us secretly disliked it. That on the morning of the 7th day, the HOA president herself appeared, Marjorie Stapleton, a woman whose entire personality seemed constructed from rules, threat letters, and passive-aggressive smiles. She didn't knock. She simply stood on the walkway, clipboard pressed against her chest, staring at me like a traffic violation waiting to be issued. She announced, without greeting or pleasantries, that the swing had to go. Not later. Not eventually. Now. There was no point arguing with her. She had the authority and she relished using it. So, with a tight jaw and a growing sense of resentment, I unhooked the swing and carried it to the garage while she stood there watching, as if ensuring I didn't commit any last-minute acts of rebellion. The moment she turned and walked away, my irritation solidified into resolve. If they wanted to take away my small comfort, then I would find a way to make something even better, something they couldn't touch. Not out of spite, or at least not entirely, but out of a desire to reclaim some control over the space I lived in. I began rereading the HOA rulebook that night, not as a compliant resident but as a strategist. The document was thick, repetitive, and full of legal jargon. But as I read deeper, I realized something. The HOA's rules were extremely specific when it came to permanent structures. Anything that required construction, anchoring, drilling, or attaching was heavily regulated. But there was an entire section about temporary structures, and it was surprisingly lenient. Temporary structures, by their definition, included anything not permanently fixed to the house or ground. They could be freestanding. They could be assembled and disassembled. They could be decorative, functional, or both. And, as long as they didn't exceed certain height limits or block communal pathways, the HOA had virtually no authority over them. As I put the pieces together, a plan began forming in my mind, one much larger than the simple swing they had objected to. If they had a problem with a small porch accessory, then they were going to absolutely despise what I was about to build. Yet the beauty of it was that it would be entirely legal. A structure so undeniably within the rules that even Marjorie would have no grounds to fight it that I spent the next week sketching designs and measuring the dimensions of my yard. I wanted something comfortable, stylish, and unmistakably visible from the street. Something that would draw attention not because it was gaudy, but because it was undeniably inviting in a neighborhood where everything felt sterile. I envisioned an outdoor lounge, a full setup with seating, shade, decor, and ambience. Something temporary enough to meet every clause of the HOA handbook, yet sturdy enough to outlast their patience. That I researched modular pergolas, pop-up canopies, outdoor sectionals, and weatherproof decor. I compared weights, installation methods, and state regulations. I read reviews from people who used similar setups in rental homes where permanent modifications weren't allowed. Every night, the plan grew more refined, more clever, and more unassailable. By the time the materials began arriving at my doorstep, curiosity buzzed throughout the neighborhood. Neighbors slowed their walks to glance at the packages. Marjorie herself drove by twice, her disapproving gaze trailing across the boxes stacked in my driveway. I could practically feel her suspicion radiating from the street. She didn't know what I was planning yet, but she knew it wasn't something she would approve of. That alone made the effort worthwhile. That on a quiet Saturday morning, with the sun barely rising, I began assembling the first components of my temporary outdoor lounge. Piece by piece, beam by beam, the structure took shape. Not attached to the house, not anchored into the ground. Entirely within my property lines. Entirely temporary. Entirely legal. And as I stood back and looked at the growing framework, I realized something unexpected. This wasn't just an act of defiance anymore. It was a statement, a reminder that homeowners still had rights, something the HOA seemed to conveniently forget. But the real test, the moment that would set off everything that followed, was still ahead. Because once the lounge was complete, once it stood proudly on my property for all to see, there would be no avoiding the confrontation that was sure to come, and I was more than ready for it. By the following weekend, the frame of the lounge had transformed into a full outdoor living space. Spacious, polished, and undeniably impressive. Even I hadn't anticipated that it would look so good. The modular pergola created clean geometric lines, the fabric canopy cast a soft shade over the seating area, and the lantern-style lights gave the entire setup a warm, welcoming glow. It felt like a tiny oasis in the middle of a neighborhood that tried desperately to resemble a luxury catalog. But unlike everything else around it, this space actually felt alive. The moment I stepped back to admire my work, I knew the HOA would hate it. News of my creation spread faster than I expected. Neighbors who barely nodded at me before were suddenly walking past more frequently, curious to see what all the deliveries had become. Some smiled, some whispered. A few gave me discreet thumbs up when they thought no one was watching. And then, of course, there were those who hurried past, pretending not to look, but their stiff posture said everything. They were already preparing to report me. But the most important visitor came Monday morning. Marjorie's silver SUV creeped down the street like a shark circling unfamiliar waters. She slowed to a near stop in front of my house, her eyes sliding across the lounge with a level of disapproval usually reserved for trespassers and people who didn't recycle properly. She didn't get out of her car. She didn't speak to me. She simply glared, took a few photos on her phone, and then drove off, tires crunching the pavement with unmistakable irritation. I knew what was coming to be. By noon, an HOA envelope was tucked against my door. This one was thicker. I opened it at the kitchen table, already bracing myself. Inside, I found 2 letters, one a formal warning, the other a demand for immediate removal of the unauthorized structure. Their wording was more forceful this time, sprinkled with phrases like non-compliant addition, visual disruption, and environmental mismatch. They called the lounge an eyesore, a violation of design standards, and a threat to the neighborhood's aesthetic cohesion. But they made one big mistake. At the very bottom of the letter, In small but clear print, the HOA cited the exact rule they believed I had broken. And I had read that rule too many times to count. They were referencing regulations about permanent structures, something built into, attached to, or anchored into property. My lounge was none of those things. Every component could be packed up and moved within hours. Temporary, mobile, completely within the rules. The more I read their letter, the more obvious it became that they were relying on intimidation, not accuracy. They assumed I didn't know my rights. They assumed I'd comply the moment they used official language. They assumed they could push me around the same way they pushed people for mailbox colors, imperfect mulch lines, and the crime of leaving holiday lights up 1 week too long. That assumption was about to cost them that I spent the next day drafting a response. Professional, airtight, and backed by every clause they didn't think I would notice. I cited their own handbook, pointed out the legal definition of temporary structures, and included photos showing the lack of anchored components. I even attached receipts showing that every piece was listed as portable. Then I ended the letter, politely but firmly, by stating that unless they had proof I had violated a specific rule, my outdoor lounge would remain. I placed my response in their Dropbox and waited. IT didn't take long. The very next afternoon, a notice was posted on the HOA's website stating that a resident has installed a large unauthorized structure. Though they didn't name me, they didn't have to. Anyone who lived within 5 houses of mine already knew. And soon after that announcement went up, the neighborhood drama ignited. Some residents quietly supported me. They liked the idea of having more freedom with their own yards. They liked seeing someone stand up to the HOA. Others muttered about me challenging the system, as if I'd committed some act of political rebellion. A few loyalists rushed to Marjorie's side, insisting she restore order before the neighborhood standards collapsed. It was astonishing how quickly a simple lounge had turned into a community battle. But things escalated further at the next HOA board meeting, a monthly ritual most residents avoided unless they were forced to attend. I went that night not because I had to, but because curiosity pulled me there. I wanted to see their reaction when confronted with the facts. The meeting room was packed, far more than usual. The air buzzed with tension. People murmured among themselves, casting glances toward me as I entered. The board sat at the long front table, papers stacked, expressions stiff. Marjorie sat in the center like a queen presiding over a minor coup. The meeting began with irrelevant agenda items, budget updates, landscaping schedules, planned maintenance. But the atmosphere shifted the moment they reached the line item labeled resident structure violation. They described my lounge using every negative adjective they could conjure. Obstructive, oversized, distracting, disruptive. They implied it damaged property values. They claimed it created visual confusion for passersby, whatever that meant. They even mentioned concerns about setting a precedent, as though my lounge would inspire residents to build entire theme parks in their front yards. Then they called on me to explain myself. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply read from a neatly printed copy of my research. Every fact, every clause, every line that proved my structure was temporary, legal, and fully compliant. The room fell quiet as I spoke, the board's confidence draining with every sentence. When I finished, the board exchanged tense whispers. Their expressions faltered. They knew I was right. They just didn't want to admit it. Finally, they announced the issue needed further review. A classic deflection. I left the meeting with no resolution, but with something more useful, momentum. People approached me afterward, asking about the rules, asking how I knew so much, asking if they too could create something in their yards without the HOA swooping in. Some were excited. Some were inspired. And a few, I suspected, were simply thrilled to see Marjorie lose footing. But the fight was far from over. The next morning, I woke to find a new envelope on my porch, thicker than the last, more official looking. And when I opened it, I realized the HOA had just escalated our quiet dispute into a full-scale neighborhood battle. Because this letter wasn't just a warning that IT was a notice of fines, daily fines, and they wouldn't stop until I removed the lounge. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was personal. The notice of daily fines was the HOA's declaration of all-out war. The letter listed each charge with cold precision, calculated down to the hour my non-compliant structure remained in place. It was an obvious attempt to frighten me into submission, to push me toward giving up, not because I had actually broken any rule, but because they needed to reassert control. It was the kind of tactic that had worked on countless residents before me. But I wasn't like the others. Instead of dismantling the lounge, I spent the next morning documenting everything, photographing each component, lifting sections to show their mobility, recording myself disassembling a corner piece and reassembling it within minutes. I saved receipts, instruction manuals, product listings. I even filmed a time demonstration of how quickly the entire lounge could be taken down if needed. I wasn't just preparing a rebuttal. I was building a case. When I sent my evidence packet to the HOA, I copied the Neighborhood Review Committee, the City Zoning Office, and the State Office for Community Associations. If the HOA wanted to escalate the situation, I would escalate it beyond their reach. I hit send with a level of satisfaction I didn't know I was capable of. Then I waited. For 3 days, nothing happened, at least not directly. But the neighborhood buzzed with tension. Residents walked slower past my house, glancing between the lounge and their phones, as though waiting for a new update to appear on the HOA website. Some people seemed visibly amused. Others were anxious, unsure what the confrontation meant for them. And a few of the most loyal rule followers watched with a sort of hungry anticipation, hoping to see me fold so they could feel justified in their devotion to the board. But the silence was shattered soon enough that on the 4th morning, I opened my blinds to find a cluster of board members standing on my lawn, clipboards out, arms crossed, scowling at my lounge as though sheer disapproval could make it evaporate. They paced around it, measuring, photographing, muttering to one another. For the first time, though, I didn't feel intimidated. Watching them scramble felt strangely empowering. Their inspection didn't last long. They left without acknowledging me, retreating like an offended parade troop. By afternoon, an email arrived from the HOA. They were commencing formal proceedings to determine whether my lounge constituted a functional permanent structure. I knew what that meant. They were desperate, but I wasn't done yet. The day before the formal proceedings, I received an email from the State Office for Community Associations, the same agency I had copied on my packet. Their response was surprisingly swift for a government office. They thanked me for the detailed documentation and confirmed that, based on the evidence, my structure clearly met state definitions for a temporary installation. They added that HOAs in the state had previously faced legal consequences for attempting to regulate such structures without grounded cause. At the bottom of the message was a sentence that made everything worthwhile. "We will be following up directly with the Willow Creek Estates HOA." I read that line over and over, feeling the tension in my shoulders melt away. And sure enough, the next day's HOA meeting was chaos. The room overflowed with residents. The air crackled with the kind of collective anticipation usually reserved for courtroom trials or reality TV show finales. People wanted answers. They wanted drama. They wanted to witness the moment the HOA either backed down or doubled down. The board members looked unusually unsettled, their stacks of paperwork disorganized, their whispers frantic. Marjorie sat stiffly in the center, her expression tighter than I had ever seen it. She called the meeting to order, but her voice carried none of its usual authority when it came time to address the resident structure issue. She chose her words with unnatural care. She didn't mention fines. She didn't mention violations. Instead, she read aloud a brief statement acknowledging that, after reviewing additional regulatory guidance, the HOA would temporarily suspend enforcement actions regarding my lounge. The room erupted. Not in applause, but in murmurs, confusion, and thinly veiled amusement. Residents looked from the board to me and back again, putting the pieces together. They realized the truth. The HOA had been wrong, and they were being forced to retreat. Some people smirked. Others whispered gleefully. A few simply nodded at me in subtle, silent support. But the board's humiliation wasn't over. One resident, a man who had lived here far longer than I had, stood up and called for an open review of all HOA rules regarding temporary structures. Another suggested limiting the board's ability to issue fines without third-party oversight. A woman near the back raised her hand and asked why the HOA spent so much time policing harmless yard features while ignoring larger community concerns. One by one, Residents voiced grievances they had kept quiet for years. And for the first time, the board looked overwhelmed, cornered by the very people they claimed to represent. Marjorie attempted to regain control, insisting that order must be maintained. But her words carried no weight. The residents weren't listening anymore. They had tasted the freedom of questioning authority, and there was no turning back. By the end of the meeting, a motion had been proposed. One to hold a community vote for restructuring the HOA board. The crowd reacted with renewed energy. It was clear the vote would pass. It was just a matter of time. When the meeting adjourned, people approached me with gratitude, handshakes, and quiet congratulations. Some thanked me for standing up to the board. Others admitted they had felt powerless before but now felt emboldened. A few joked that my lounge had become the symbol of a miniature neighborhood revolution. That I left the gathering with an unexpected sense of responsibility. Not the heavy kind, but the meaningful kind. I hadn't planned to become the face of neighborhood change. I just wanted to keep a swing. But somehow, that simple desire had ignited something larger. In the weeks that followed, the HOA's power shifted dramatically. The fines issued against me were formally withdrawn. The board's attempt to retroactively change rules was blocked by the state agency's intervention. And, most surprisingly, 3 board members, including Marjorie, announced their resignations after the motion for restructuring passed. The neighborhood transformed slowly but noticeably. People added small personal touches to their yards. A colorful planter here, a wind chime there. Conversations on evening walks became warmer. Residents who once avoided eye contact now waved, and my lounge. It remained exactly where it was, standing proudly as ever. On quiet evenings, I would sit beneath the canopy, a gentle breeze drifting through the space, the soft glow of lanterns illuminating the yard. The lounge wasn't just a structure anymore. It was a reminder of resilience, of rights, and of the power a community could reclaim when someone refused to be intimidated. The HOA hadn't just lost a fight, they'd lost their hold on the neighborhood. And all because they wanted to ban a simple porch swing.